Okay, so it's now recording.
Okay.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. We'd like to welcome you to the second interview in our interview series on international studies in the Philippines, Mapping New Frontiers in Theory and Practice, published by Routledge. We are interviewing Dr. Alan Chong today, author of the chapter José Rizal Attacks Imperialism Softly, Comprehending the Depths of Psychological Conversion and the Temptations of Violent Solutions. Alan Chong is an associate professor and the acting head of the Center for Multilateralism Studies at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. He has published widely on the notion of soft power and the role of ideas in constructing Asian international relations in journals such as Contemporary Southeast Asia, Review of International Studies, and the Cambridge Review of International Affairs. Conducting the interview will be myself, Francis Cruz, and Dr. Nasifa Diong, both from the University of the Philippines, Diliman, and the editors of this book. Good morning to you, Alan, and we hope you're doing well.
Yes.
Okay, so firstly, perhaps you could talk a little bit about factors, events, and experiences that have influenced you as a scholar and shaped your thinking about the world.
Well, my introduction to Philippine political studies, if you can coin that term broadly, came actually through a simple friendship with someone who was finishing up a doctorate at the then, English Language and Literature Department at the National University of Singapore, where I was, encountering literature on Southeast Asia in English as a very fresh undergraduate. So this friendship with Professor Lily Rose Tope, blossomed into discussions about Filipino heritage in literature and so on and so forth. So she just casually suggested when I visited her years later, my first visit to Manila, that I pick up a copy of José Rizal's, novels, either one, and then I started reading and I realized that this, enables me to unlock a lot more of the modern Philippine literature, and the grappling with modernity that you see in day-to-day Philippine politics comes out of a lot of Rizal's dilemmatic thinking. Rizal is not an easy read. I spent a lot of time going through just the two novels and then, of course, the fragments of his readings published nicely by the Philippine Historical Association and so on. Simply because he sees politics and society in general as characterized by dilemmas. You want liberation from colonial authority. Are you prepared to use their tainted means to achieve your liberation? You see? So in that sense, he warns you from a very moral and philosophical perspective. Yes, independence on paper is noble and good and so on and so forth. But are you prepared to use these tainted means to get what you want? Because, he recalls from it and he doesn't give you, a definitive formula, if you think that there's one. At the end of his writings, he will give you calls to action that comes out of so many fragments of his writings. But he doesn't definitively say to you, look, this is the way forward. Revolution is the way forward. You get these surer forms of calls to action, from the other nationalists, across the South China Sea, in Malaya, in Indonesia, and of course all of Indochina. But Rizal stands, to me, head and shoulders above the rest because he is a bit of a Hamlet type character. I don't know how many of your readers will be familiar with Shakespeare's Hamlet, because Shakespeare's Hamlet, again, is a character that's both political and literary, in the sense that this character looks at life in a very similar way. On the one hand, you want to change things because you're uncomfortable or thoroughly dislike the existing state of things. On the other hand, you have to use means which you thoroughly dislike and are opposed to what you believe in to achieve, what you hope would be a better life and so on. So Rizal to me comes across like that. And that's why I hope, to my modest contribution to your volume, that more audiences, both young and people in our age category, would appreciate the fact that Rizal is such a rich thinker that we need to study him as our Asian contribution to either international studies or political studies and so on.
Thank you very much for that, Alan. I do also agree that Rizal is a very complex figure in Philippine history and has yet to be studied, despite the fact that a lot has been written about him.
Yes, and if I may interject also, I missed out thanking FISO. Again, I'm not saying this because you are hosting this interview, but I do think that FISO has this important mission. And that's why I'm happy to associate with all of you in this volume of actually opening the psychological doors and eyes and ears of not just Filipinos but also our fellow Asians to the fact that we have this rich intellectual heritage in our own backyards and which is still not being recognized despite all the pretensions of Western scholars saying, oh, we are living in a global age or globalizing age, therefore we will at some point read each other. I'm not sure we're there yet. Okay, so this volume is so important in drawing attention.
Yes, I think that was also one of our goals when we set out to produce the volume and to solicit chapters to bring to light some of the contributions of Southeast Asians or Filipinos in particular to understanding the international. I know that you've already talked a lot about some of the background of your chapter. Perhaps now you could talk about the structure and the thesis of the chapter in more detail, if you'd like to do that, so that our viewers will have some kind of idea of what to expect.
Okay, wonderful. I'll save the intellectual suspense for the actual reading of the chapter. Basically, I thought that the notion of imperialism needs to be brought up front and center. And again, this is a phrase chosen by me deliberately to shock the audiences out there, because imperialism seems like a word that's passé. It belongs to the 1960s when our so-called nationalist forefathers had to literally fight or negotiate using a variety of means to get the colonial rulers to leave. But it is with us today, you see, and I deliberately chose two contrasting words in the title. José Rizal attacks imperialism softly. How can you attack imperialism softly when it's such a loud concept? Yes, but this is precisely why we should read Rizal. He's fascinating in that regard. He does talk about the guns, the cruelty, the brutal, naked suppression of people's liberties and so on in his various writings. But on the other hand, if you carefully pass through his novels, they are fantastic pieces of not just literature, but political writing, in the sense that if you look at the characters, the way he positions class, social stratification, there's so much more that I could have unpacked. And I mean, with due scholarly humility, I must also pay tribute. Here I thank Frankie for directing me to a few Filipino authors whom I have not come across before in the final editing of the chapter. That I hope also to channel some of their underappreciated research through my citation of them in my chapter. And perhaps this should be also an open invitation for them to communicate with me and for me also to talk to them and so on. I don't know how my first chapter on Rizal in Lily Link's volume on decolonizing Asia has been received in the Philippines. So I hope this one actually, opens up a huge corridor of communication with scholars in the Philippines, also trying to understand what this post-colonial Asia, not just the Philippines, is all about. And so I structured the chapter in this way. I deliberately sketched a very long introduction where I wanted the reader to understand. I deliberately want you to connect with the rest of Asia in this. We were all part of this anti-colonial movement and still are. All right. So this book, edited by Nassef and Frankie, is not just meant for Filipino studies people. It's beyond that. And I hope it does cross borders, because you have to understand that Rizal was actually thinking of the nature of colonial manipulation or imperialist agendas, not just from Spain, but also from the United States, and of course the other colonizers across the entire Asia, the British, the French, the Dutch, so on, even the Portuguese. The Portuguese were ironically one of the last to be kicked out by nationalist means. And then I had to discuss a little about Rizal's own life. He was in many ways privileged to have seen the world, to quote the title of a popular 60s pop hit, seen the world from both sides. He was a privileged member of the mestizo class, meaning he had access to Western education. He didn't always have to work, like a farmer. He was a physician. He spent, and this was extremely rare for most Filipinos to be of that era, studied in Europe. So he's been on the side of privilege, and then, he's writing in his novels from the perspective also of the downtrodden, those with no voice, no access to education. So I found this fascinating, and I wove that into a brief sketch of his background. And then, I looked at how he understood the notion of privilege, and how imperialism may, in some cases, have started with good intentions of civilizing the natives, between the commas. Again, this language is awkward. Even as I wrote the chapter, I found this language awkward. But it comes out of Rizal's novels, because he himself was grappling with this. Who are los indios? Are they people who cannot be redeemed? You see, this is very uncomfortable language for today's politically correct globalization. But it is what it is. And in a sense, this pandemic that's roiling all our societies has brought this back to us. How do you get people to behave, during a pandemic? How do you appeal to them regardless of race, class, social stratification, and so on? So I think these issues are with us. And sadly, the politicization of the pandemic is going on in a very undesirable way all around the world, with Trump and Xi Jinping and all manner of populists in every country that you can think of. Politicizing it, saying that, it's a disease that's brought in by others. And of course, the othering can go on in so many ways. It is not just the foreign other. It could be the class enemy or the ethnic enemy in your midst. So in that sense, I think Rizal is still so very relevant to us. So I spent a lot of time talking about how he tried to, understand this intellectual and emotional gap between socially stratified people. And of course, I spent a lot of time in the last half of the chapter, trying to understand what you're saying about the use of violence. Now, violence is everywhere, especially so today, when we have this coincidence between pandemics, visiting biological, medical violence upon its victims, and then the state coming in saying that, we need counter violence against the violence of nature. And between these two notions of clashing violence, you have people in between. So in that sense, I think Rizal deserves a read. And I draw attention, I know I'm not supposed to be showing this book, but this is El Filibusterismo, that I think the most highly praised translation in English. Towards the end, and I quoted this phrase, and I would like to just draw your readers' attention or viewers' attention to it. You know, he ends with an almost biblical admonition. May nature guard you, violence, okay, the you here refers to violence, in her deep abysses among the corals and pearls of her eternal seas. When for a holy and sublime end men should need you, God will draw you from the breast of the waves. Meanwhile, there you will do no evil, you will not distort right, you will not foment avarice. Now, if you read this carefully, this is almost like a sermon, either for Good Friday or Easter. Right? But it's so right for these troubled times, because if you say that the state needs to amass for itself unrestricted power, okay, I am not referring to any particular politician, but so many politicians around the world are saying it. We need to clamp down on people's liberties. We need to imprison them, okay, in the name of quarantines, lockdowns, and all this kind of very disturbing language in their own homes. What are you saying? You're saying that violence is justified by the extremity of the situation. And in that sense, José Rizal is warning that are you prepared to look yourself in the mirror and say that in order to fight this evil that I don't like, I have to become like it. You see, and he doesn't give you a clear answer. You know, in the two novels that I deeply mined for this chapter, he says that, you know, are you prepared? And he leaves it like that, hanging. And I think the closest Western comparison to that would be perhaps Plato, Aristotle. And that's where I think Rizal still needs to be read and reread as to what exactly he would have done had he actually led an organized nationalist movement. I mean, tragically, he passed away. I mean, he was executed. Let's just put it bluntly. Before he was actually forced to make a choice as to whether to lead, you know, a nationalist movement against the Spaniards. And I don't know what he would have thought about the Americans coming in to replace the Spaniards. All right. So I'll leave things as they are for this part of the interview.
Thank you for that. Food for thought, perhaps, for our viewers. Maybe you could say something very quickly about how you think this will impact international studies in the Philippines in terms of the themes that we talk about in international studies. Do you think that this will have some kind of impact, or that it leads towards a certain path that's less taken maybe in international studies?
Yes, the theme of violence in response to violence, I think that will immediately surface. You see, and I fully understand everyone is angry at China right now, firstly, for not giving the world the benefit of advanced forewarning about the coronavirus. And number two, just about all the claimants in the South China Sea are angry at China for not conceding an inch. And you see, this is where Rizal comes back to inform our opinion. The Chinese, I think, have not been very honest in admitting that they equally have been victims of colonialism. All right, and you should channel that into empathy for the rival claimants in the South China Sea. They've all been victims. So in that sense, you cannot claim to be more of a victim than the rest. And also for domestic governance, you know, there's so much Rizal has said about domestic governance cryptically. You know, again, populists are on the march everywhere, and populists seem to be drawing strength from the pandemic to even buttress their powers even more. So all these things, I think, can be found in terms of what Rizal has reflected about. And he doesn't give you a clear answer. It's just that he forces you to think through them. You know, if you want to use violence, can you be sure that it's going to lead to a better outcome? Because if you can't, maybe it's better to just muddle along. All right, so I think these are very pertinent questions that Rizal raises. And of course, in my own country, Singapore, I think Rizal will not be treated, as an action-oriented form of reading, because my country is all about taking action and so on. It's ingrained in the somewhat manufactured political culture here. But those students and intellectuals who are discerning will want to pick up Rizal simply because he tells you that I'm helping you think through all the dilemmas in politics, domestic and international. In terms of state-to-state relations, again, what populists today will find very uncomfortable is the fact that early on, excuse me, in both his novels and his fragmentary writings, he held deep in his conscience this reserve of goodwill for the mother country, because he believes that Spain actually provided the Philippines with the gift, however contentious it might be, of civilization. Of course, some of the authors in this volume will disagree with that. And again, if you go back to how Rizal, the propagandist, wrote about Spain's gift of civilization to the Philippines, he was initially in two minds. He wanted to condemn the Spaniards, but at the same time, having spent so much time consuming the ideas of the European Enlightenment, both in Spain as well as in Germany and France and England and so on, he understood that this is what the European gift should ideally be. We take the best ideals of the Enlightenment and make it our own, make it work for us as a future free people. But then there's this problem of violence, which the Europeans have not solved back then, even today. You look at how the European Union has shown tremendous disunity in their response to the pandemic. It undermines what the European Union claims to be, a form of civilian soft power that they hope to be, but they're not acting in unison. And you look at the border closures, that underlines a blame game going on between Germany and France, and the greatly suffering Mediterranean fringe of the European Union. So, again, the question of the right means in political solutions need to be reflected against the outcomes. All right, and that's where I think I'll leave it for the moment.
Alan, for answering those three questions that we've had for this interview. Now that this is your second chapter on Rizal as your contribution to the study of international studies in the Philippines, I think that I, as students and also early career scholars, would like to seek you for your advice regarding international studies as a field of knowledge and as a profession for the students and for the novice scholars in the Philippines. What advice can you provide them?
Well, I would say that international studies cannot be limited to a very definitive field of text, scholars, readings, and so on. They should understand it as part and parcel of the evolution of society, however you define it, whether it's global society or your national society. And then the influences, and here I comment again the volume, the influences come from everywhere. They're from old-fashioned state-to-state relations, and I note a number of chapters, still follow that paradigm. And then there are chapters that look at history, how history actually shines a light on the lineage of ideas for the post-colonial Asian state. And then there are also chapters that look at how modern political developments far away from Asia inspire local understandings of the international as well as of local governance and so on. So I know this may be disturbing to a lot of people starting out in this field, but that's the way I think international studies should be approached, through this very broad cross breeding of ideas across disciplinary borders and so on.
Thank you, Alan. And our very last questions is how can international studies in the global south, particularly here in Southeast Asia, can move forward, can advance, and have a conversation with the mainstream Western international relations? What are your thoughts about
this is still an uphill battle. And of course, he posed this question at a time when I just received another rejection from another mainstream Western journal. You know, they told me that your ideas are refreshing. We learn a lot from them. But, you see, and this is a big but with a capital B, we are not interested in publishing you because we think that you have not adequately carried out a conversation with certain mainstream, and here mainstream comes bracketed with Western, great thinkers. So please try the sociology section, the culture studies section. You know, this is, I think, a long-term struggle for a dialogue. In the sense that while we want to talk to the West, they're not prepared to talk to us by reading us, you see. So I hope that my modest contribution will put Rizal a little bit closer to front and center for Western trained scholars and Western scholars who want to understand Asia. Don't start from the usual premises of, oh, all the world's a realist playground, all the world's a liberal playground, you know, and then there's nothing else. I come in from anywhere in the Western world. I just spent 1 year in Asia and I know it all. No, that should not be the case. Okay, and again, this volume I think should open up a lot of doors and, you know, hidden passageways for the discerning scholar. So in that sense, my personal struggles getting recognized in the so-called mainstream journals in international studies or international relations mirrors, you know, my approach to the study of Rizal.
Thank you so much, Alan. Since I think we have a very limited time for this recording. Frankie.
They gave us the notice for extra time.
Yes.
And at least on my end.
Yeah. So I guess we should start to wrap up. We'd like to thank Dr. Alan Chong for sharing his thoughts with us today. And please stay tuned for more interviews from international studies in the Philippines. See you soon.